on the next Podium. With so many cultures and religions, how can society build a common sense of community? Join Harvard's Diana Eck, Simeon Ilasanmi from Wake Forest University, and the University of Canterbury's Mike Grimshaw as they look for historical clues to the present-day puzzle of pluralism. It's all coming up on the next Podium.
People in their right.
It's really exciting to be here and participate in a panel with people, most of whom I've never met before. And so it really will be, I hope, a conversation. The question of how we move beyond our comfort zone, whatever that is, as scholars, as people of faith, as citizens, is really one of the great questions in the world today. Moving beyond our comfort zone to engaging with people who are different from us. And I believe that pluralism really begins with difference. It is not some sort of namby-pamby attempt to reach a lowest common denominator, but rather to encounter and bridge our differences, bridging them in the sense of creating those vital channels of communication, whatever they may be, that enable us to produce the traffic that is necessary for a world as connected as ours is. I think there are two things that we recognize about our world today. One of them, the tremendous impact of migration, and the other, the real impact of communication revolution. As for migration, we have countries in which Tamil and Telugu Hindus have built temples in Strasbourg and in Bern and in Atlanta as well, and all over the United States, in which global Hindu movements like the Swaminarayan movement has made a bid to have major Hindu institutions, not only in Delhi, but also in Neasden outside London, in Houston, in Atlanta, and many other places as well. A world in which in the United States, the Sikhs work with the National Transportation Safety Board for their civil rights to move about freely being Sikh and not be continually investigated for the presence of their turbans, in which just last week a young Sikh boy, fourth grader in Texas, won the right by the energies of the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education group to wear his patka, a little sort of smaller turban covering his top knot, to school when he had been prohibited from doing so. These are some of the contestations of the comfort zone contact that are taking place today and are very important contestations. And of course, the Sikhs in America today are busy responding to President Obama's discomfort with going to the Harmandir Sahib in India, visiting the Golden Temple, needlessly, as they say, adding fuel to the fire to those who still insist that he's a crypto-Muslim, and of course who acquiesce in the fact that Muslims and Sikhs are continually confused with one another. So speaking as an American here, this has really changed the map of America, as it has surely of Australia and many, many other places in the world. Migration is an important fact of the world's life today. I grew up in a small town in Montana, Bozeman, Montana, never met a Hindu until I went to India, and now there are Hindu Americans living in Bozeman and celebrating Diwali, and my mother cuts the pieces out of the newspaper, sends it to me. It almost brings tears to my eyes to think of Hindu Americans in Bozeman, Montana, pulling everyone else into the dances of their celebration of Diwali. So migration is an important thing, and of course as we look at different regimes of pluralism, you might say, America has a particular one because we are a nation largely of migration and encounter. It has not been an easy road for all of us. From the first encounters of pilgrims and Puritans with the native people who lived here, to the later encounters of Protestants with Catholics who came, and there was a huge anti-Catholic movement in the mid-19th century. In Boston, the attack on one of the convents of Boston, for example, with Jewish people who came in various waves of migration to the United States and also encountered some of this kind of hostility, homegrown hostility to the Mormons as well. And so when we look at this in light of the new anxieties of America over their dawning awareness, our dawning awareness of the presence of Muslims among us. And it is a dawning awareness because, honestly, many people simply did not know until that big mosque started to gain approval for its plans in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. They did not know that there were so many Muslims here. Well, they had been invisible. They had been going for Friday prayers to storefront centers, to things that didn't look very new at all. But when the big billboard went up, said future site of the Islamic Society of Murfreesboro in Tennessee, people came out to protest. We didn't know they were here. How did this happen? Aren't we fighting with these people in some part of the world? These people carrying signs that said, this is a Christian country. Why are these Muslims here? And suddenly we have a level of discourse that is really very stridently anti-Islamic. Not just about zoning, not just about traffic, not just about things that, that are kind of the softened view of the fear of the other, but real anti-Islamic discourse. And I think we need to see it in this wider context of the migrations that have come to compose the American fabric. And then beyond immigration, there's the communications revolution in our globalizing world that is absolutely essential. When I first went to Benares and worked on my first research in the 1970s, you couldn't even make a phone call, really, from Benares to the United States. And now you can sit on those great ghats that go down into the Ganges River and call on your cell phone or any satellite phone, get a very good connection. Virtual communications have transformed the reality of religion in the world. So powerful is this communications technology that the real divide is that digital divide between those who do and don't have access to it. So globalization, in this sense, has its own exclusions. And as the Human Development Report of the UN put it, even a decade ago, the collapse of space, time, and borders may be the creation of a global village, but not everyone can be a global citizen. And the report documents the ways in which the wealthiest 20% of the world control 86% of the world's product. I think now it's even greater than that, whereas many are simply left out of this paradigm of globalization and its supposed benefits completely. And you can access this kind of sobering report because we all have computers. We in the United States probably have more computers than the rest of the world combined. I can print it out if I want to. We try not to these days, but we in the United States also account for, the richest 20% account for 84% of all the world's paper production. So how do we think about the ethical dimensions of globalization? How does it reshape religious life? These are religious issues, these are civic issues, and these are scholarly issues. And let me just say a word about each. For religious people, refining our awareness of what the Buddhist philosopher Thich Nhat Hanh called our interbeing, the fact that we really are interrelated in profound ways, that no one lives or speaks alone. No one's growth takes place alone in this global context. And refining our religious awareness of our interbeing, our interdependence, is one of the great religious tasks of our time. It's a task for Christians, for Muslims, for Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, for secular people as well, and that is really the challenge of pluralism. We all live in the presence and the power field of the other. As Abraham Joshua Heschel put it, no religion is an island. For scholars of religion, and that includes most of us, refining our ways in understanding and our analysis of the ways in which globalization is reshaping the energies of religious communities is one of the most challenging tasks of the humanities. The study of religion is not only increasingly important, but increasingly difficult. And it will require the very best of our students, the ones that go into cognitive neuroscience, we want those students in the study of religion. We need to try to get them in the study of religion because this is as hard a research area as cognitive neuroscience. Our technological achievements span the globe, but we have not developed the religious literacy and learned the languages of inspiration and transcendence that animate people with whom we share the globe. So our ability to think in new ways will challenge us as scholars of religion to understand some of the swift currents and white waters of religious life today and of interfaith encounters. Now, it also challenges us not only as religious people, if you are religious or even if you're secular. It challenges us as scholars of religion, but it also challenges us as citizens of whatever country we are part of. These are questions of citizenship. They're handled in very different ways in different countries. Coming from the United States, we have challenges of citizenship that are posed by Muslims, by Sikhs, by others, what you can wear, where you can wear it, etc. That's a particular paradigm of pluralism that has been shaped by the Constitution, by the First Amendment, free exercise of religion, non-establishment of religion. Where is that line? It's a different paradigm in Britain where nobody cares at all about whether you wear a turban here or a hijab there, unless you're wearing a full face mask and are a primary school teacher. In France, it's quite a different thing. I mean, all of their talk about laïcité, and they've been spending years and years talking about nothing but religion. So there's a different way of thinking it. In Indonesia, in India, we have still the same problematic of pluralism, but different constitutional and different hereditary, you might say, the things that we inherit from previous generations, ways of dealing with difference as nations. So I think it makes a great deal of sense that we're gathered here today and we have contributions from Nigeria and from China and from Australia and New Zealand, where all of us are concerned about this issue of living with difference in a globalizing world, and where we really can learn from each other and from the energies that we bring together.
I also want to thank the organizers of this special panel. I think it is a very timely and obviously a globally relevant topic that we are focusing on. Secondly, I'm trying to look at this issue, especially the issue of religious pluralism, in the context of what I would call the non-plurality issue in Africa, which is the non-plurality of poverty. The discourse on the paper I have titled is Religious Pluralism in Africa in the Age of Globalization. The discourse on religious pluralism and globalization in relation to Africa is often accompanied by the judgment that these two phenomena have impacted the continent in different but disparate ways. Most scholars and commentators celebrate religious pluralism, not only because it captures the cultural realities of social life in Africa, that is, a continent often seen as having immense diversity in religious, ethnic, and regional configurations, but also because it resonates with our modernist sentiments. In effect, we can say that modernity has engendered what we might call pluralist consciousness, an awareness and growing appreciation of plural traditions. Many have argued that this consciousness is innate or inherent in Africa, and that modernity has merely confirmed what indigenous religious worldview had long insisted upon, namely that the divine or the sacred cannot be confined within one ideological or conceptual framework, but is rather more accurately apprehended through various media. The continued success of Islam and Christianity in all their varieties, as well as the resilience of indigenous religious tradition in Africa, is credited by scholars with the robustness of plural consciousness in Africa. In contrast to this sanguine view of religious pluralism, globalization is perceived as a threat to Africa's cultural integrity and welfare interest. The widespread suspicion about the dynamics and processes of globalization is fueled by the perception that they are linked to the capitalist agenda of the West and are therefore a revival or an extension of the colonial projects of the preceding centuries. While this suspicion is partly or maybe justified, it is a fact that both religious pluralism and globalization are as old as the origins of civilization, predating the 18th century colonization as a particular form of economic and labor relations. Second, the achievements of both are at best ambiguous and at worst problematic, especially in the African context, where the history of proselytization remains a highly contested subject. The difficulty they present, that is both pluralism and globalization, that they present for our lives is uncertainty and confusion over the fundamental ideas and ideals that should provide direction in the judgment we make, in the decision we make, and in how we conduct our lives. Particular practical problems associated with religious pluralism in the context of Africa are about authenticity and legitimation. Authenticity and legitimation. The former having to do with the cultural credibility of religious traditions that are domiciled in Africa and the authority to speak for these traditions by those who study them. Authenticity requires us to ask whether there is a basis for making distinctions among the religions of Africa with respect to their compatibility with African spiritual temperaments. Which of them are authentically African? How do we make that judgment? Legitimation raises the issue of religion's capacity to define the normative boundaries for an individual's self-understanding, as well as to provide the cultural framework for the construction, critique, and reform of socio-political order.
I come from a small city on the east coast of New Zealand which has 380,000 people. My context for thinking about this is one of my daughters goes to a primary school of 500 students that has 36 different nationalities, different ethnic identities within it. And that's everyday pluralism, but it's also what I might call everyday cosmopolitanism, because what I want to do is actually start to think about challenging, pushing the boundaries. What I do is I teach a lot on theory as well, but I also come from a religious studies program that has actually had to fold. In a world that is actually increasingly religious, I come from a country where the study of religion is something to be embarrassed about. And so I'm folding into becoming a sociologist. My children are a lot happier. They can describe their dad as a sociologist, not a scholar of religion. And a colleague is becoming an anthropologist. And those are the areas where religion is being studied increasingly in countries like my own, apart from if you've got a major centre of 6 scholars, I think, as Paul has in Wellington, 7. And that's a massive area to study religion in our country. So I come from a very secular place to study and think about religion. My starting point is Gabriel Vahanian has traced the secular back to saculum, which is the world of shared experiences. And as he states, in a pluralistic world, what we have in common is not religion, it is the secular. Now, my response is a yes, but, because what we do and say and how we act within this world of shared experience raise a series of issues regarding the limits of pluralism in public space and questions of religion and identity. So for a New Zealand context, I mean, in New Zealand in 1854, the first debate of the first parliament regarded religion. It was a question about should we open with prayer, and if we do, what does it mean, and who's going to do it, and what does it mean if this person does it and not another. So a really pragmatic compromise was reached, which said, the House distinctly asserts the privilege of a perfect equality in all religious denominations. So this meant my country was constituted as existing without any formal religious identity, that did not confer or admit any preeminence to any church or religious body, and this is still the case today. Now, this was a very pragmatic compromise because when we think about it, people were excluded. Women and Maori were not represented, the indigenous population in that first parliament. And in the wider secular society can be looked back as a white male European and Protestant-derived construct. And its forms of accepted plurality that carried on from this reflected those bases. We forget just how Protestant modernity actually is. And especially those of us who might be Protestant or post-Protestant, it suits us. But you just have to talk to the people who aren't Protestant and just realise how much of what we do is sort of Protestantism by default. So perhaps this is a question about sovereignty. Now, to raise Carl Schmitt, which I know is controversial, but Schmitt said all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularised theological concepts. So perhaps we need an extension yet rejection of Schmitt, and what I might term a para-secular sovereignty that all claims to identity can be included under, which I call a cosmopolitan saculum. So what we have to do is a cosmopolitan pluralism of individuals who operate across a series of pluralisms. Nobody's just one essence or one group or one pluralistic identity. Class, race, ethnicity, education, culture, gender, secular identities, politics, faiths and non-faiths need to be articulated. So I think this starts with a claim of the universal human subject, a controversial claim, a problematic claim I know, whereby being human takes precedence over all other claims of identity and difference. Because as Appiah notes, the twin foci of cosmopolitanism are that everybody matters and that there are different local ways of being human.
The interesting parts are the way the context changes from one country to the other. The other thing I think is just, you know how difficult it is. How on one hand, it seems from the descriptions, we all accept, yes, it's a pluralistic society, but what does that really mean? How does that mean engaging